Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the Bag murders. We begin our journey in London during the biting, damp winter of January 2002. Imagine the streets of Camden Town at night. The air is thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and the distant, metallic tang of the underground trains. Orange streetlights cast long, shimmering reflections across the puddles on Royal College Street, flickering as the wind pulls at the power lines. It is a world of brick and iron, where the cold doesn't just touch your skin, it seeps into your bones, settling in the marrow. Everything is quiet, save for the rhythmic patter of a light drizzle against the window panes of the Victorian terraces. In this stillness, inside a modest block of council flats, a story began to unfold that would eventually haunt the city for decades. But on this night, the horror was still hidden behind layers of silence and wood. The police were not looking for a monster when they arrived at the estate. They were responding to a call about a neighborly dispute, a flash of petty cruelty. Someone had poured battery acid through a woman's letterbox and scrawled offensive, jagged graffiti across her front door. The officers climbed the stairs, their heavy boots thudding softly against the worn, industrial carpet of the hallway. Each step echoed in the narrow space. They reached the flat of a man named Anthony Hardy. He was 51 years old, a man whose presence was as gray and unremarkable as the winter sky. When he opened the door, the air that spilled out was stale, carrying the faint, sweetish odor of unwashed clothes and old paper. The officers stood in the threshold, the yellow light of the corridor spilling into his cramped living space. Hardy's voice was thin, a dry rasp that seemed to catch in the back of his throat as he spoke. He was cooperative, yet there was a strange, vibrating tension in his frame, like a wire pulled just a fraction too tight. As the officers moved through the flat, noting the clutter and the shadows that seemed to pool in the corners, they came upon a door that wouldn't open. It was a simple wooden door, painted a shade of cream that had yellowed and cracked over the many years. It was locked. When asked, Hardy shook his head slowly, his eyes darting toward the floor. He claimed he had sublet the room to a woman who was currently away, and that he didn't possess a key. He spoke of her as if she were a ghost, a passing acquaintance who had vanished into the London fog. But as the police prepared to take him into custody for the vandalism, they performed a routine search of his person. In the pocket of his jacket, their fingers brushed against a cold, jagged piece of metal. It was a key. The silence in the flat deepened as an officer stepped back toward the locked door. The metal slid into the keyhole with a sharp, echoing click. The handle turned. The hinges gave a slow, rusted groan, as if the room itself was reluctant to yield its secret. Inside the room, the air was unnervingly still. The light from the hallway cut a sharp, rectangular path across the floor, illuminating a scene that appeared, at a first, fleeting glance, almost peaceful. Lying upon the bed was 38-year-old Sally White. She was naked, her body partially covered by the soft, heavy folds of a duvet. The room was small, the walls decorated with fading paper that seemed to peel away in long, tired strips. There were flowers in the room, but they had long since wilted, their petals brown and brittle like autumn leaves. As the officers moved closer, the piece began to fracture. There were dark, dried stains on the wall above the bed, the silent map of a struggle. A bite mark, purple and angry, was visible on her thigh. A wound marred the skin of her head. Yet, despite these jagged pieces of evidence, there was a profound sense of stillness. Sally looked as though she were merely caught in a deep, dreamless sleep, her eyes closed against the harshness of the world that had failed her. This is where the narrative takes a tragic, baffling turn into the fog of institutional failure. A pathologist named Freddie Patel was called to examine the scene. He looked at the blood on the walls, the injuries on Sally's body, and the fact that she had been discovered locked inside the flat of a man with a history of violence. Yet his conclusion was startlingly clinical. He ruled that Sally White had died of natural causes, a heart attack triggered by heart disease. To the investigators, this ruling was a wall they could not climb. If the death was natural, there was no crime. There was no murder to solve, only a sad, lonely end for a woman who had been living on the margins of society. The blood was explained away. The locked door became a footnote. Anthony Hardy was processed for the vandalism and eventually moved into a mental health facility. But the shadow of Sally White's death was officially wiped from his record. The room was cleaned, the key was turned once more, and for a time the city moved on, unaware that a predator had been granted a reprieve. The failure to see what lay right in front of them would have devastating consequences. Sally White's life had been difficult, marked by the struggles of addiction and the dangers of sex work, but she deserved the dignity of an honest investigation. Instead, her story was tucked away in a file, labeled as a natural tragedy rather than a human one. As January turned to February, and the winter rains continued to wash over Camden, Anthony Hardy sat in a hospital ward, knowing a secret that the rest of the world had chosen to ignore. He had looked into the eyes of the law and found them closed. The locked door had been opened, but the truth remained hidden in the darkness of that small flat on Royal College Street. This was only the beginning of a much darker winter. And as we close this chapter, we are left with the haunting image of a woman whose cry for justice was muffled by the very system meant to protect her. Sleep now, if you can, knowing that the shadows are long, and the truth is often much quieter than we expect. The morning of December 30th, 2002, did not begin with a sunrise so much as a slow, bruising transition from ink black to a muddy charcoal gray. London was caught in the heavy, breathless lungs of a deep winter, the kind that settles into the Victorian brickwork of Camden Town and refuses to leave. The air was a thick curtain of damp frost, and the lingering scent of coal smoke and exhaust, hanging motionless over the empty streets. It was the peculiar, suspended time between Christmas and the New Year, a week where the rhythm of the city falters and the usual gears of industry grind to a halt. Because of the holiday schedule, the communal bins behind the shops and pubs were overstuffed, their heavy lids failing to close over the mountains of discarded wrapping paper, empty glass bottles, and the remains of festive feasts. The trash collection was a full day behind, leaving the alleyways of Royal College Street crowded with shadows and the slow, rhythmic drip of melting ice. In the silence of the early hours, the only sound was the distant, lonely hum of a street lamp and the occasional scuttle of a fox darting through the darkness. The city was sleeping off its celebrations, unaware that within the mundane clutter of the everyday, a darkness of a much deeper sort had been left to wait in the cold. Through this landscape of gray stone and freezing mist moved a man who knew the secrets of the bins better than anyone. He was a scavenger, a soul living on the jagged edges of the city, driven by the sharp, persistent ache of hunger that the winter only made worse. To him, the communal bins behind the College Arms pub were not a place of refuse, but a potential source of survival. His hands, rough and map-like with the lines of a hard life, were tucked deep into the pockets of a thin coat as he approached the large, wheeled containers. The metal was frigid to the touch, a searing cold that seemed to bite right through his skin. He reached out, his breath blooming in white clouds before him, and heaved upward on the heavy lid. It groaned on its hinges, a sound like a low, rusted complaint that echoed against the brick walls of the narrow alley. Inside, the usual chaos of waste greeted him, but as he began to sift through the top layers, his fingers brushed against something different. It was a black plastic bin liner, tied tight with a double knot, but it felt strangely heavy and solid, lacking the crinkle of paper or the clatter of tin. It had a density that made his heart stutter with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He pulled the bag toward him, the plastic slick with a film of condensation. It was deceptively heavy, pulling at the muscles in his forearms. When he managed to tear a small opening in the side of the bag, the air around him didn't fill with the sour smell of rotting food, but with something far more metallic and cloying. In the dim, flickering light of the street lamps, he saw something that made the world go silent. It was not a discarded toy or a piece of butchered meat from the pub's kitchen. It was the unmistakable, pale curve of a human limb. The sight was so surreal, so utterly removed from the logic of a quiet London morning, that for a long moment he simply stared. The cold seemed to intensify, freezing the blood in his veins. In a state of shock, driven by a desperate, panicked instinct to seek help, he did not run for a phone or a passerby. Instead, he gathered the grim discovery and began a long, trembling walk toward the nearby hospital. He moved like a ghost through the streets of Camden, clutching the plastic bag to his chest, the weight of it an impossible burden. He walked until he reached the sterile, fluorescent warmth of the emergency department, where he placed the bag on a counter and spoke the words that would shatter the peace of the holiday season forever. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the sterile quiet of the hospital was replaced by the urgent crackle of police radios and the heavy tread of boots. Officers were dispatched to the alleyway behind the College Arms pub on Royal College Street, their blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement and the red brickwork of the surrounding estates. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape that fluttered in the biting wind, creating a barrier between the world of the living and the horror they had just uncovered. As the sun began to peek through the gray clouds, investigators in white forensic suits moved with agonizing slowness through the communal bins. They found more than just the first bag. One by one, they extracted 8 more bin liners, each heavy with a terrible secret. They were carefully numbered and placed on the cold ground, a grim inventory of a life dismantled. The officers worked in a grim silence, the only sounds being the rustle of plastic and the distant chime of a church clock. Then, 100 yards away in another wheelie bin, they found the torso of a young woman, wrapped with the same chilling, methodical care. The scale of the crime was beginning to emerge. A jigsaw puzzle of human remains scattered like unwanted debris across the heart of the city. The remains were transported through the morning traffic to the St. Pancras mortuary, a place of stone and clinical silence. There, under the harsh glare of the examining lights, the full depravity of the act was revealed to the pathologists. They were looking at the remains of 2 different women, both of whom had been treated with an unthinkable lack of humanity. The work of the killer had been precise and cold. To the horror of the investigators, the heads and hands of both victims were missing, a deliberate attempt to strip them of their identities and to hinder the wheels of justice. Despite this, the forensic teams began the painstaking process of reconstruction. They determined that the victims were likely killed sometime over the Christmas holidays. Their lives ended while the rest of the world was singing carols and exchanging gifts. The first victim was eventually identified as 34-year-old Bridget McClennan, and the second as 29-year-old Elizabeth Valad. Both had been vibrant, living souls just days before, and now they were reduced to evidence in a cold room. The air in the mortuary was heavy with the weight of what had been lost, and the police knew they were no longer just looking for a killer. They were hunting a predator who had turned the sanctuary of the home into a slaughterhouse. As the news of the discovery began to spread through Camden, a shadow fell over the neighborhood. People looked at their own communal bins with a new, visceral fear, wondering what might be hidden beneath the lids. The investigation moved with a frantic energy. Detectives began a door-to-door canvass of the local estates, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. They looked for witnesses, for anyone who had seen a man carrying heavy bags in the dead of night, or for anyone who had heard the sound of a power tool screaming in the silence of an apartment block. It wasn't long before a trail of dark, dried droplets was found on the pavement, a faint path of blood that led away from the bins and toward a specific block of flats on the College Place estate. The proximity was chilling. The killer had not traveled far to dispose of his victims. He had treated the neighborhood as his own private dumping ground. The police turned their gaze toward a ground-floor flat, a place where the curtains were drawn tight against the world. They remembered a name from a previous investigation, a man who had already been touched by the presence of a dead woman in his room less than a year before. The name Anthony Hardy began to circulate through the precinct, a name that would soon become synonymous with a new kind of urban nightmare. The air over Camden on the afternoon of December 31st, 2002, was a thick, biting gray. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the heavy wool of coats and settle deep in the marrow of the bone. As the rest of London prepared for the boisterous celebrations of New Year's Eve, a small group of investigators moved with a different purpose toward the Royal College Street estate. The concrete walkways of the housing complex felt unusually desolate, the festive lights in distant windows offering no warmth to the task at hand. Every footfall on the damp pavement echoed with a hollow, rhythmic thud, a sound that felt amplified in the unnatural stillness of the courtyard. They were returning to flat number 8, a ground-floor unit that had already begun to whisper its secrets to the neighborhood. The brickwork of the building looked dark and porous, as if it had been soaking up the gloom of the winter for decades. There was no sound of music here, no clinking of glasses, only the low, constant hum of the city in the distance and the whistling of the wind through the metal railings of the balconies above. When the officers reached the door of flat number 8, they found it was not locked. It yielded to a gentle push, swinging inward with a slow, heavy groan that seemed to announce their arrival to an empty home. As the door opened, the air from the hallway rushed into the apartment, and the smell hit them, a thick, cloying miasma that was impossible to ignore. It was a scent that combined the sharp, chemical tang of cleaning agents with something much older, much darker. It was the unmistakable, metallic odor of a mortuary, a scent that lingers in the back of the throat long after the breath is taken. Stepping over the threshold, the visual landscape was just as jarring. The walls were not merely dirty. They were decorated with a frantic, disturbing energy. Crude drawings and paintings of Celtic-style crosses were etched and brushed onto the surfaces, some appearing in dark, drying pigments. The floor was a mosaic of debris, discarded papers, empty bottles of cheap alcohol, and the cluttered remnants of a life that had spiraled far beyond the reach of reason. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should have been, clinging to the edges of the furniture like velvet soot. In the center of the main room, a small desk sat beneath the dim light of a single, dust-covered bulb. On top of the desk, almost as if it had been placed there for them to find, was a fresh roll of black plastic bin liners. The plastic had a dull, oily sheen, and the edges of the roll were slightly frayed where the last bag had been torn away. This simple household item felt monstrous in the context of the week's discoveries. Beside it lay the paraphernalia of a chronic illness, vials of insulin and syringes, the quiet evidence of the occupant's struggle with diabetes. The investigators moved through the kitchen, where the sink was piled high with unwashed plates and the surfaces were sticky with spilled liquids. Every movement they made was cautious, their eyes scanning the floor for any sign of what had occurred in the preceding days. The silence of the flat was heavy, broken only by the occasional drip of a faucet or the distant siren of an ambulance somewhere out on the main road. It was the home of a man who lived in the cracks of society, a loner whose internal world had finally manifested in the physical decay of his surroundings. The atmosphere shifted as they approached the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the scent of bleach grew stronger, mixing with the underlying rot. Pushing the door fully open, the investigators were met with a sight that would haunt their sleep for years to come. In the bathtub, they found the remains. It was the torso of a woman, later identified as 29-year-old Elizabeth Valad. The scene was clinical in its horror. Nearby, a common hacksaw lay on the floor, its blade dull and stained. Forensic lights would later reveal that although the room had been scrubbed, the ghost of the violence remained in the fine spray of blood that had settled into the grout and the corners of the tiles. There was a sense of methodical, cold-blooded precision to the disarray. The killer had not just ended a life. He had treated the human form as something to be dismantled and discarded like refuse. The bathtub, once a place of cleansing, had been turned into a butcher's block. The realization that more parts were missing, the heads, the hands, the feet, cast a renewed chill over the room. The inventory of the macabre was not yet complete. As the forensic teams began their painstaking work, the most pressing question remained. Where was the man in flat 8? Anthony Hardy was nowhere to be found. The bed in the small bedroom was empty, the covers rumpled as if someone had recently risen from a fitful sleep. A search of the nearby Royal Free Hospital would soon reveal a chilling clue left behind in the quiet of the hospital chapel. On a small piece of paper, a note had been pinned, written in a cramped, desperate hand. It asked for prayers for the immortal soul of Tony Hardy, dated December 30th, 2002. It was a plea for mercy from a man who had shown none. He had fled into the night, a predator now fully aware that the world was closing in. CCTV footage from a different hospital on New Year's Day would later show a man matching his description, his heavy beard now completely shaved away in a crude attempt to alter his appearance. He was out there, somewhere in the labyrinth of London streets, moving through the crowds of revelers as the clocks ticked toward midnight and a new year. The hunt for Anthony Hardy was no longer a local inquiry. It was a desperate race against time. The police warned the public not to approach him, describing a man of 6 feet and 3 inches, a looming figure who might be in need of medical attention but was driven by a much darker necessity. As the fireworks began to explode over the River Thames, illuminating the sky in bursts of red and gold, the investigators in Flat 8 worked in the cold, artificial light of their lamps. They documented every smear of blood, every scrap of plastic, and every line of the haunting graffiti on the walls. The air inside the forensic laboratory was thin and clinical, smelling faintly of ozone and high-strength disinfectant. It was a space defined by a heavy, artificial silence, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the ventilation system. On the stainless steel tables lay the grim harvest of the Camden bins, wrapped in the same dark, heavy plastic that had been their final shroud. The investigators moved with a quiet, practiced reverence, their gloved hands moving through the fragments of lives that had been violently interrupted. In this room, the frantic energy of the manhunt outside was replaced by a slow, agonizingly detailed process. Because the killer had removed the heads and hands of his victims, the usual paths to identification were closed. There were no faces to recognize, no fingerprints to scan against the national databases. They were looking at pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across the gray landscape of North London, and the task of giving these women back their names felt, at first, like an impossible burden. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a cold, bluish tint, casting long, sharp shadows over the sterile surfaces where the truth was waiting to be found. Among the remains found in the bins behind the College Arms pub, and later within the shadowed confines of Anthony Hardy's own apartment, the pathologists found a singular, vital clue. One of the women had undergone surgery, and deep within the tissue, the surgeons found breast implants. Each of these medical devices carried a tiny, unique serial number, a string of identifiers that acted like a digital fingerprint. It was through these numbers that the investigators first heard the name Elizabeth Valad. Elizabeth was 29 years old, a woman whose life had begun far from the grim alleyways of Camden. She was the daughter of a university professor, born in the quiet, historic city of Nottingham in 1972. Those who knew her in her youth remembered a girl with an artistic, rebellious spirit, a young woman who had lived for a time in America before returning to the United Kingdom. She was a mother herself, having a daughter in her late teens, and for a while she had moved in circles of wealth and luxury, supported by a millionaire partner. But the glittering lights of that world had eventually faded, replaced by the harsh, flickering neon of the London underground. As her life spiraled into the grip of crack cocaine addiction, Elizabeth drifted into the shadows of King's Cross, her vibrant past becoming a collection of fading photographs and distant memories. While Elizabeth was identified by the marks of modern medicine, the second woman required the even deeper language of biology. Bridget McClennan was 34 years old, and her path to the bins of Camden had been a long, geographical journey. She was originally from New Zealand, a country of vast, rolling greens and sharp, clean air, thousands of miles away from the damp, gray winter of London. Bridget was the mother of 2 young sons, boys who were aged only 8 and 6 when their mother disappeared into the winter night of 2002. Her identity was confirmed through DNA profiling, a process that felt almost spiritual in its complexity, matching the microscopic blueprint of her remains to the samples held on file from her previous brushes with the law. Like Elizabeth, Bridget had been swallowed by the same cycle of addiction and vulnerability. She had once been a woman of poise and clear speech, but the weight of her struggles had led her to the streets, where she sought the means to numb the pain of a life that had fractured beneath her feet. In the sterile quiet of the morgue, the realization that these 2 women from such different worlds had met the same horrific end brought a profound, heavy sadness to the investigation. The forensic experts worked with a methodical pace, documented the defensive wounds and the horrific precision with which the bodies had been dismembered. In the bathtub of the flat on Royal College Street, they found the invisible traces of the struggle, blood that had been scrubbed away, but remained visible under the chemical glow of luminol. It was here, in the small, cramped bathroom, that the 2 women had likely drawn their last breaths. The investigation revealed that Anthony Hardy was not a stranger to them. He was a regular customer, a man who played upon their desperation and their need for safety. In his possession, the police found 44 pornographic photographs he had taken of them, haunting images where they were posed in strange, theatrical ways, sometimes wearing masks or hats. These pictures were more than just evidence. They were a window into the twisted psychology of a man who viewed human beings as objects to be arranged and then discarded. The methodical nature of his crimes was becoming clear. He had used his apartment as a stage, a place where he could exert absolute control over those who had nowhere else to turn, transforming a home into a site of unimaginable coldness. As the names Elizabeth and Bridget were finally written onto the case files, the investigation took on a new, more urgent dimension. This was no longer just about the man who had run into the shadows of the hospital grounds. It was about the failures of a system that had allowed these women to vanish without an immediate outcry. The forensic team spent hours sifting through the bin bags, finding small, personal items that told of the lives they had tried to maintain. A piece of fabric, a specific shade of lipstick, the texture of a worn-out coat. These were the fragments of a life that the killer had tried to erase, but which now served as a testament to their existence. The detectives realized that Hardy's violence was not a sudden explosion, but a calculated, repetitive process. He had lived amongst his neighbors for months, the sound of his power saw and drill muffled by the thin walls of the council block, a sound they had dismissed as mere home improvement. The sheer ordinariness of the setting made the discovery all the more chilling. While London prepared to ring in the new year of 2003, the police were beginning to understand that the 2 women found in the bins were not the beginning of the story, but the tragic continuation of a pattern that had started long before the first bag was ever opened. The transition from the closed, heavy atmosphere of the flat on Royal College Street to the sprawling, indifferent expanse of London, felt like a sudden intake of frozen air. Outside those walls, the city was draped in a thick, sulphurous winter fog that seemed to cling to the brickwork and muffle the sound of distant sirens. The news had broken across the capital like a slow-moving tide of dread. Descriptions of a tall, imposing man with a heavy beard and a long black leather coat were circulated to every patrol car and every late-night news bulletin. But the man the police were hunting had already begun to shed his skin. In the quiet, shadowed corners of a city that rarely sleeps, Anthony Hardy was attempting to disappear into the very crowds that now feared his name. He moved through the transit hubs and the darkened alleyways of Camden and Bloomsbury, a ghost among the living, carrying with him the weight of a brown bag and a secret that was slowly being unearthed by the forensic teams back at his apartment. The air in London during those first days of January, 2003, was biting, the kind of cold that settles in the marrow of your bones. Yet the heat of the manhunt was intensifying with every passing hour. On the evening of New Year's Day, beneath the harsh, flickering hum of fluorescent lights at University College Hospital, a man stepped out of the shadows and into the clinical reality of the casualty department. He was wearing a black baseball cap pulled low over his brow, the brim casting a sharp line of shadow across his eyes. His long leather jacket was scuffed, smelling faintly of stale tobacco and the sour tang of old beer. Most strikingly, the thick, graying beard that had defined his police description was gone. In its place was a face of raw, pale skin, unevenly shaven and nicked by a trembling hand. He approached the desk with a strange, heavy-lidded focus and gave his name without hesitation. Anthony Hardy. He was there to collect a prescription for insulin, a desperate necessity for a body ravaged by diabetes and the toll of his recent flights. The nurses noticed the way he swayed slightly, the way his fingers drummed a rhythmic, nervous pattern on the laminate counter. When they began to ask for a fixed address, a standard procedure for the paperwork of the weary and the unwell, the atmosphere shifted. Hardy's eyes, usually dull, flashed with a sudden, jagged panic. He became agitated, his voice rising in a sharp, defensive rasp before he turned on his heel and vanished back into the night, leaving behind a trail of unease that would soon lead the authorities directly to his heels. The following day, the hunt narrowed to the quiet, red brick streets around Great Ormond Street. A member of the public, having seen the grainy CCTV images now haunting the television screens, recognized the man in the leather coat hovering near the hospital grounds. The air was damp with a fine, misty rain that turned the pavement into a dark mirror. As the police closed in, they found him not in a grand hiding place, but tucked away behind a row of large, industrial refuse bins, the very objects that had become synonymous with his crimes. The silence of the evening was shattered by the sudden, heavy boots of the Territorial Support Group. There was no peaceful surrender. When the officers reached for him, the man who had seemed so frail at the hospital transformed into a frantic, violent force. In the chaotic struggle that followed, the narrow alleyway became a blur of dark leather and flashing blue light. One officer felt a sharp, searing pain as a blade pierced his hand, while another was struck with such force that his eye was dislocated from its socket. It was a desperate, animalistic resistance, the final thrashing of a man who knew the walls were finally touching. Despite the injuries, the officers held their grip, the metal of the handcuffs finally clicking shut over wrists that had, only days before, wielded a much more permanent edge. Inside the interrogation room at the North London police station, the air was still and sterile, a sharp contrast to the bloody struggle in the rain. Anthony Hardy sat across from the detectives, his large frame filling the chair, his movements now slow and almost unnervingly deliberate. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and the cold, metallic scent of the recording equipment. As the detectives laid out the evidence, piece by grueling piece, the bin liners that matched the rolls found in his bedroom, The DNA discovered on a hacksaw, the chilling photographs found in his possession, Hardy remained a fortress of silence. To every question, every accusation, every plea for the families of the women he had discarded, he offered only 2 words: no comment. His voice was a flat, monotone murmur, devoid of the agitation he had shown at the hospital. He looked at the photographs of Elizabeth and Bridget not with remorse, but with a detached, clinical gaze, as if he were looking at someone else's life entirely. There was no flicker of a confession, no crack in the facade of his calm. He sat there, 51 years old, a former engineer who had mapped out a world of darkness, now watching the clock on the wall tick away the final hours of his freedom. The silence in that room was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the 3 lives he had ended, and the shadows he had left across the city of London. The air inside the Old Bailey in November of 2003 felt thick, as if the very walls of the Central Criminal Court were exhaling the weight of centuries of judgment. The high, vaulted ceilings were lost in soft shadows, and the scent of floor wax and old, weathered paper hung heavy in the stillness. Within this grand, somber space, the footsteps of the court ushers echoed with a lonely, rhythmic tap against the polished floor, a sound that seemed to mark the passing of time for a man whose own time was quickly narrowing. Anthony Hardy sat in the dock, a figure who seemed almost too ordinary for the darkness he carried. He was a man of 62 years then, his frame appearing small against the backdrop of the massive oak paneling. The gallery was packed, yet a profound silence reigned, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. You could hear the faint, distant hum of London traffic outside, a world continuing its frantic pace while inside, life had reached a terrifyingly still point. The light filtered through the windows in thin, dusty beams, illuminating the tiny motes of dust that danced in the air, oblivious to the gravity of the proceedings. Everyone waited, their breath held, as the legal machinery began its slow, deliberate turn, ready to finally address the horrors that had haunted the streets of Camden. The surprise that rippled through the courtroom was not a loud one, but a collective intake of breath that felt like a cold draft. Hardy, who had remained mostly silent and uncooperative during the long months of investigation, suddenly spoke. With a voice that was low and devoid of any outward emotion, he entered his plea. He did not fight. He did not offer excuses. Instead, he whispered the word guilty to 3 counts of murder. The weight of that word was immense. It wasn't just for Elizabeth Valad and Bridget McClennan, whose remains had been found in those cold, rain-slicked bin bags. It was also for Sally White. Her name hung in the air like a ghost, finally finding its voice. You may remember that in January of 2002, a year before the bin bags were discovered, Sally's body had been found in Hardy's flat, tucked away in a locked room. At the time, a pathologist had mistakenly ruled that the 38-year-old had died of natural causes, perhaps a heart attack brought on by the stress of her life. The police had closed the file. They had seen the blood on her clothes and the stains on the wall, yet they had accepted a version of reality that allowed a predator to walk free. In that courtroom, as Hardy confessed to her murder, the silence became a heavy shroud of regret. The realization that Sally's death could have been the end of the tragedy, rather than the beginning of a larger one, pressed down on everyone present. As the details of the case were laid bare, a tapestry of missed opportunities began to reveal itself, each thread a moment where the path could have changed. We must look at the sterile, brightly lit hallways of St. Luke's Hospital in Muswell Hill. It was there, only weeks before the final murders, that Hardy had been held under the Mental Health Act. The doctors and staff walked those linoleum floors, checking charts and monitoring his behavior. He was a man with a history of domestic violence and deep-seated psychiatric issues, yet the communication between the health authorities and the police was like a bridge with missing planks. Information fell through the gaps. The warning signs were there, written in ink on reports that sat in beige folders on cluttered desks, Yet he was released back into the community, back to the council flat on Royal College Street. The tragedy of the Camden murders is not just found in the actions of one man, but in the quiet failures of a system designed to protect. We think of the police officers who stood in his flat a year earlier, the smell of damp and neglect surrounding them as they looked at Sally White. We think of the pathologist, Dr. Freddie Patel, whose standard of work was later criticized as irresponsible and incompetent. These were moments of silence where there should have been a roar of intervention. The weight of these missed chances is a heavy burden, a reminder of how easily the vulnerable can slip through the cracks of a busy, indifferent city. The judge, Mr. Justice Keith, eventually spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a steady flame. He looked at the man in the dock and spoke of the unspeakable indignities that had been visited upon the victims. He noted that only Hardy truly knew how those 3 women had met their ends, but the evidence of his depraved needs was beyond doubt. The sentence was 3 life terms, a declaration that Anthony Hardy would never again breathe the free air of London. He was taken away, down the narrow stairs to the cells below, leaving the courtroom to exhale at last. Years later, in November of 2020, the story reached its final, quiet conclusion in a prison cell, where Hardy passed away from a respiratory illness. But the closure of a legal file does not mean the weight of the silence disappears. For the families of Sally, Elizabeth, and Bridget, the silence is a space where a loved one used to be. Elizabeth Valad was only 29, a woman whose life was a series of bright possibilities before it was extinguished. Bridget McClennan was 34, remembered by those who knew her for a spirit that deserved more than the cold finality of a Camden winter. Their names deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for the fact that they lived, and that their absence left a hole in the world that no court sentence can ever truly fill. Now, the streets of Camden are quiet, the rain washing over the pavement just as it did all those years ago. The flat on Royal College Street has new tenants, new lives, and new stories, though the bricks themselves might still hold the memory of those cold December nights. The files in the police archives are yellowing now, the ink fading as they are moved to deeper storage. The shadows that once stretched long across the College Place estate have softened. We reflect on the lives lost and the lessons learned, hoping that the vigilance of the future can prevent the silence of the past from ever becoming so heavy again. Let the images of the courtroom and the gray London sky begin to dissolve. The details of the investigation, the legal arguments, and the long searches in the rain are drifting away, becoming nothing more than a soft murmur in the distance. You are here, in the present, wrapped in the safety of the now. The world outside is still, and the day has reached its natural end. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.